essentially, to start off, essentially the conversation, if anyone doesn't know who Dr. Singer is or Professor Singer, he is actually a world-renowned author, especially of animal liberation, which is considered one of the most profound books on animal ethics to date. And it's something that I studied myself in university twice. I studied it in undergrad and at master's. Because it's such a good piece of work. You work primarily in normative ethics and practical ethics, from what I'm aware. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. So Professor Singer is here to talk about why we should value animals. And I think it's a very important topic for today's world because over 70 to 80 billion land animals a year are killed for food. And I think you said yourself that the number one place humans interact with animals is on their dinner plate. So for anyone who's watching, consider the impact of your day-to-day activities. And that's what we are going to talk about today. So thank you for coming on, Dr. Singer. And out of curiosity, so why should we value animals? I'll just present that to you just as a straight up question.
Well, I think we should value animals because animals, it's not true of all animals. I'm not going to say this is necessarily true of oysters, but the animals that we mostly eat, the vertebrates, and some invertebrates perhaps, are capable of feeling pain and of experiencing pleasure. In other words, they're subjects of experience. Their lives can go well or badly for them. And I think the world is a better place if there's less suffering in it and more beings enjoying their lives.
Right. And when you say subjects of experience, you say that should we value everyone's experience equal to our own, or is it just, or is it like subject dependent? So, for example, do I value another being's experience only in regards to my own? So extrinsically value, or other beings intrinsically valuable?
I think insofar as we're taking an ethical perspective, we should be looking at this from an impartial point of view. If you like, imagining we're taking the point of view of the universe, not that the universe really has a point of view, but we can imagine looking at it that way. And so your experiences don't count for more than the experiences of another being, provided those experiences are similar in quality. So you could imagine, let's say, that maybe it is the case that we normal humans with our various capacities intact have a variety of experiences that can be very intense, both very intensely negative and very intensely positive, whereas maybe some other animals have a rather more limited kind of conscious capacities. Possibly this is the case with some invertebrates, maybe with some vertebrates as well. It's speculative, but certainly we can imagine that. So my view is that if other beings have similar interests and similar experiences to us, similar capacities, then we should value them equally. If they don't, then maybe it's appropriate to provide some kind of discount, just as we would discount our own experiences in terms of, if we had to choose between a day in which we had some dull pain, a dull headache, let's say, and a day in which we had a very severe, painful headache, we would say, I'd rather take the one with the dull pain. So there's a sense in which we can be impartial and still say, if beings have different kinds of experiences from us, then that does get discounted to a proportionate extent.
Is it the difference in experience, or is it as in like simply being unintelligible, or is it the fact that those experiences are not having the same value response? So, for example, is it that I couldn't understand the life of an octopi, or of octopi or octopuses, or is it that the life of an octopus still has its own unique pain and pleasure, and I would take that interest into account based on its biology?
I think we don't really know enough about what the experiences of an octopus are like. I think that if I'll go with octopuses right here. If octopuses have experiences that are roughly similar to ours, and if they value them, maybe not consciously valuing, not having philosophical discussions about their values, but if they're in a painful or distressing situations, they try to get out of that, and that's a clearly negative thing for them. Then that might be comparable to ours. An octopus is an interesting example because in terms of the beings that I think we can confidently say have conscious experiences, it's the most remote from us in evolutionary terms. It's the most different from us. The division between invertebrates and vertebrates goes back a very long way. So we don't really know. The behavior of octopuses actually is quite remarkable. And it may well be that they have quite rich and complex experiences.
Yeah, and would you say that because we don't know, if we are in a situation where we are ignorant because of our lack of scientific understanding upon a creature, should we err on the side of caution, or do you think, let's say, consuming and eating octopi would be justifiable?
I think we should err on the side of caution where it's something that clearly would cause serious harm if the being does have consciousness that's in some way similar to and on the other hand, it's not necessary for us to do whatever will inflict this harm on the octopus. So in your case of, let's say, catching and eating them. If I'm starving on an island and the only thing that I can do to survive is catch octopus out of the water and eat them, I guess I will do that. But if it's a matter of saying, shall I have the tofu or the octopus, then there's no question that I'm going to say, thanks, I'll have the tofu.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Obviously, I'm a vegan myself, and I guess I guess one of the things that I'd kind of wonder in this scenario then is there any, like, you being a utilitarian, is there a justifiable limit to the point in which you should be obligated to self-sacrifice? Let's say there was a number of animals, for example, that, if we were carnivorous, should we continue the human species, or if we were carnivorous, should we not allow ourselves to go extinct? Or should we even, let's say we could survive on a desert island and we could consume octopi, but let's say this would be an indefinite amount of octopi and their suffering being alike our own is, assuming like our own, is valuable, then should there not be a limit in which we are willing to sacrifice ourselves for these animals?
Well, in the case that you're on a desert island and you're going to have to continue to inflict a lot of suffering, and we assume the suffering is comparable to your own, then it's difficult to justify that. So I suppose my position would be probably it's wrong to continue to inflict that harm on indefinite number of animals if we assume the harm is similar to what you would be experiencing if you didn't live. But on the other hand, because you're well, it's a very big sacrifice you're being asked to make. So although I would say if you're an ideally good person, you would make that sacrifice, I'm not really going to blame you for not making it.
So we would be more
because I'm
like
not sure that I would make it myself.
yeah, so more
Like
like the
what?
the Buddha-esque figure, like where we're willing to sacrifice, so feed ourselves to lions. It is a deity indeed that would be able to do that.
Yeah, it's a saintly like thing, and I mean, we have situations in the real world where also people make choices that others are not prepared to do, giving away virtually all their money and living very cheaply so that they can help others to survive. There are people who donate kidneys to strangers. I confess I still have 2 kidneys, although donating a kidney to a stranger is a very good thing to do, and I admire people who do it. So I think you can draw this distinction between what you're what you think is right and wrong, and what you're prepared to blame people for not doing.
Mm. Okay, that's interesting. Like as if there's moral thresholds of behavior. There's the minimum, and then there is things that go beyond the call of duty, or maybe not duty for a utilitarian as yourself, but
No,
go
utilitarian
beyond
won't,
them.
won't use that language.
No.
But there is a discussion of this in Henry Sidgwick's Methods of Ethics. Sidgwick is, I think, the greatest of the 19th century utilitarians as a philosopher, and he talks about the use of praise and blame itself being a standard. Well, since praising or blaming somebody is an act, it's something that utilitarians must judge in terms of its consequences. And to be blaming people for not being saintly is likely to be counterproductive, because what we want to do is to use standards of praise and blame to improve people's level of action. So in the case of donating to help people in extreme poverty, raising that standard. But if you say, look, unless you reduce yourself to rags, you're just a person, is likely to be counterproductive. Much better to say, let's start with tithing or something like that, and try and work up from there.
And I think you even say, give 10% of your wealth kind of thing to charity, and you try to make reasonable, easy to follow, actions for individuals so that they can enter practical ethics in a way that's not going to absolutely disrupt their lives and put them off from it, from what I'm aware. And I think that is a good approach to take. I guess one of the things I'm very much interested in is this idea of taking this God's eye view, almost, this world view, or this universal view of suffering, suffering simpliciter. I think I've heard you say before. Whether it's possible, and or whether we are doing, are we making the same sort of error that Kant makes when he talks about abstract goodness. What does it mean to feel pain if pain is not being felt by someone? And would it not be better to reconcile this problem with a Hegelian approach? I know you've wrote obviously an introduction to Hegel, and are incredibly well read on Hegel yourself. So would it not be better to relate the suffering to the individual and their place within the collective, and see the hermeneutic relationship between, the particular and the universal? Or is it better to just take a purely objective God's eye view of it all?
So I do think that subjective experiences are experiences of individuals. We can say how those individual experiences are affected by their place in society. But I'm not quite sure what you're suggesting by suggesting a Hegelian view of this beyond that a simple point about the social role. Because for Hegel, the whole story of human history is working towards some kind of self-awareness, that kind of the achievement, the goal of history, a kind of liberation and self-understanding of mind or spirit itself. And I don't accept that teleological view of the universe. So although I find Hegel an interesting philosopher, I have to part company at that. And so that's why I go back to something more like Sidgwick's point, as I say, which is trying to imagine your point of view of the universe and thinking what makes things better or worse from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand, especially especially I think you also wrote a book on Marx, who actively attacks the Hegel's view of teleology and replaces it with his own. So I can, there's this ongoing, what is the end goal of history seems to be just almost a guess anyway. So it is interesting.
They both get it wrong. I think, as you say, Marx replaced Hegel's idealistic teleology with his own materialist teleology, but it would have been better to reject teleology altogether. I think
that's very interesting.
That was a big mistake.
See, obviously, I'm a Hegelian, and I'm currently writing my PhD on Hegelian on a Hegelian defense of animal liberation, as in the moral consideration of other sentient beings. And I think that I think what interests me about all of this is that I think there needs to be a focus on the reasoning behind why we actually value the other and whether the other encompasses the animal. It seems to me that Levinas kind of sums this up very well when he says that there is the primordial expression within the being that, like, we first, before we form language, we can understand the suffering and pain alike with another being, which allows us to understand our own suffering. And I think we have to make the important point that to reject another animal's suffering as being alike to our own, if it is alike to our own, is to limit our own knowledge of our own well-being, and so we actively harm ourselves by not considering the other. Would you agree with that, or do you think that we can be egoists and rational?
That's a very interestingly different perspective from, I guess, what I've taken. And to answer your question, I don't exactly think you can be egoist and rational, because in a book that I co-authored called The Point of View of the Universe, which is an examination of Sedgwick's ethics and its application to current problems, I argued that, or my co-author and I argued that to be fully rational is to take the point of view of the universe. It is to see oneself as just one being among others, and to see the interests of others as counting just as much as your own. So on that view, which admittedly I think is we're sticking our necks out a bit there, and we may get our heads chopped off. I wouldn't say that it's been greeted with unanimous enthusiasm by reviewers. But if that is right, then you can't be fully rational and be an egoist. But at the same time, are you harming yourself? Because your argument, which is, as you say, a very Hegelian argument, is that there's a sense in which you're harming yourself if you deny the feelings of another, or the consciousness of another, when that consciousness is there. So I'd say you're being less rational, but you're not harming yourself in the sort of conventional way that people think of harming yourself. That is, that, well, your life is going to be, less happy for you than it would have been if you didn't have this view. I don't feel that I could argue that.
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. That's my job.
Good.
Yeah, I guess my position's almost. I'm trying to take sort of the Aristotelian view as well, that all men desire to know. And so we're in this scenario where knowledge is instrumental to a happy life. Although many people say ignorance is bliss. So we'll see how that goes. But it's definitely something that I think I'll be putting my neck out with as well.
Yeah, is this the first ever Hegelian defense of animal liberation?
It's the only one I've ever heard.
Right, good. Well,
And Hegel's not a fan of animals either.
No.
No, he seems to think that lesser, but I think he makes the same argument about women. So like, it's not
Yeah.
something that I think he can actively defend. I think it should be interesting to at least see how it's met by other Hegelians. But I also wanted to ask you actually a question. Did you ever read the Wittgensteinian attack made by, I think he's called Leahy, in Against Liberation?
Michael Lay, I think you may maybe pronounce it. But yeah, I did read that many years ago, though, so don't ask me for details. But yeah, I wasn't a fan of that, obviously.
Yeah, he seemed to say that there was a psychological that the psychological differences between animals and humans justified difference in treatment because they lacked the subjectivity necessary to process the sense experience of pain and pleasure, that they were incapable of suffering. How would you respond to that?
So, I mean, one is whether we're going to use the term suffering in this restrictive sense that says a being can't suffer unless they can process this in terms of this I, in terms of saying this is happening to me. That on this view, newborn babies can't suffer. No, I'm not sure at what point infants become capable of suffering, but presumably not for some months. Whereas I think most of us would think that if a baby has colic, that baby is crying and so on, seems to have pains in their stomach, that baby is suffering, is going through something unpleasant, and is experiencing that as unpleasant. So perhaps you could take Leigh's view as saying what really matters morally is not the kind of suffering that the newborn baby or young infant has, but the kind of suffering of beings who do have that sense of themselves, that self-awareness. I think you would need some argument for that I didn't really find in that book. I don't see it as obvious that that's the case. And it does have, as I was just saying, these consequences that there are some humans who like this. Clearly, babies are one group, and those with permanent, irreparable cognitive disabilities would be another. Does that mean that they're in the same moral category as animals? This is an argument that's been discussed in the literature that I've used, and in fact, it goes right back to Bentham. So I can't remember now what Leigh says about that, but that would be something that you would have to bite, I think. To me, it's, as I say, I don't think you really need a sense of the eye of the consciousness, but arguably it goes back to what we started talking about, that there are somewhat different conscious experiences between beings who have that sense and those that don't. And if that's so, then the line of beings who, if you like, have this kinds of experiences that we ought to give the most weight to would be somewhat higher. It would be beings with some cognitive capacities. So it may be that there are non-human animals that have this. You would argue that chimpanzees would have this. There's good evidence that they have this sense of themselves and a sense of their existence over time, and other great apes. And then the question is, what about cows and pigs and so on? So, it may have some relevance, but I still think pain, even in the absence of this sense of oneself, does matter, is bad, and ought to get some weight. And we're not giving that weight to animals when we abuse them in the way we do, put them in factory farms and give them miserable lives just because we like the taste of their flesh. That seems to be going too far, even if there is this distinction that we were talking about.
I would completely agree. I think that in many ways, your disposition of talking about interests is a good way of kind of discussing this, because and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems as though there is a distinction in your work between interests and a preference, almost, without a preference maybe that my initial feeling of wanting to do an action, but my interest would be what would actually benefit me in my overall experiences. So if I'm a drug addict, for example, may want heroin or whatever drug they want to take, but then it would not be in their interest to take it. And it seems that it would be a struggle for Leahy maybe to argue against something like that, to say that the self-conscious preferences of an agent are not what we are considering, but instead the overall interests. But also, it seems to me that it might be even it might even be worth criticizing the psychological unity I think is presented within the Wittgensteinian position. I don't think it ends up holding up anyway. This idea that we just come out and we're self-aware. There's the question of how we even became self-aware, and I think you can go the Lacanian route, or the Lacanian, the Hegelian, or there's a few other. I think even Robert Brandom attacks the Wittgensteinian, linguistic view that everything is a concept of language and nothing obtains to reality, and there's all of this metaphysical baggage almost that I don't think he deals with either. So I do think that there is some definite holes within Leahy's argument. So if anyone does want to pick it up, it's a decent read, but I don't think it holds up. I guess one last I think there was one last thing I wanted to ask you, and it's just left me mind there. I think, was it Um, oh, it's totally gone. Oh, yes, actually, it was when you were talking about the psychological differences and the complexity of, let's say, a chimpanzee, a human, obviously scaling upwards, and how our consideration for each being would change. Now, what I wanted to ask is, would the moral value of each being change as the complexity increases? Should it increase with it? Because from my understanding, for example, and I like to think of this in the terms of like a baby. If a baby falls over and hurts themselves, they mightn't be able to psychologically distance themselves from that pain because they lack self-awareness. They're in a quote unquote ready to hand state, and they feel that suffering. Whilst an adult might be able to grit their teeth and bear it, know the pain is going to end, may understand the pain better. So could it not be argued that, let's say, a cow, chicken, or a pig might feel more physical, might feel more of a psychological embrace to the moment of pain than the complexity of a higher order being? And so when we say that there is a greater moral value for those beings that are self-conscious to a greater degree, could we not be making a mistake?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said then, and in fact, I made a similar argument in Animal Liberation that
I think you did, yeah.
the complexity cuts both ways. So in some cases, we may certainly suffer more. We lose somebody we love. Maybe we are more acutely aware of that. We think of it on more occasions. Maybe it takes longer. We grieve for longer, or just the fact that we know we're going to die maybe is a cause of suffering, which it's not for other beings. But on the other hand, I think the example that I gave is something like. So suppose that we are that you're ill and I'm taking you to the doctor and the doctor's going to do something unpleasant to you. I can tell you, look, this is for your own good. You're going to get an injection. This is what we say to our children, right? Once they can understand, it'll hurt a little bit, but it'll pass. Whereas, you take your cat to the can't explain that to your cat, and presumably it's actually a much worse and more distressing experience to go to the vet for your cat than it is, let's say, for your 7-year-old kid.
I completely agree. I think that's a great point, and the reason I raised that is because I think it is like this. It does cut both ways, as you say. That the complexity argument seems to have purport on both sides of the equation, and I think that when people consider the factory farming and the environment of it, and we consider something like a chicken only being able to adapt to, I think, 100 chickens in the pecking order, that kind of psychological distress that might be overcome through language is not available to be overcome for those sentient beings in that environment. And I think it's very interesting. And thank you, Professor Singer, for obviously coming and giving your time and allowing my audience to hear you answer these questions. I think they'll find it very interesting, and I know I have.
Good. Okay. I'm happy to talk to you, and you've obviously got an interestingly different philosophical perspective as well. So I wish you all the best in developing it.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. I know I need it.
Good.
And have a
Okay.
lovely day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye then.
Bye.
Bye.